So this film is Naked Island by Kaneto Shindo. And Shindo was one of a number of leftist or socialist or communist directors who really started their career after the Second World War, when obviously the situation in Japan had changed enormously, and there was this opening for people who perhaps wouldn't have been able to deal with social themes before. They tried to embark on doing this sort of social cinema. He had been an assistant to Mitsuguchi, as all directors in those days were apprenticed to other directors. In a way, his situation was a bit like Kurosawa's. Kurosawa was also, or had been, a member of the Communist Party who became an apprentice director and then a director. But Kurosawa seemed a little more flexible and did very well both in the American shogunate and after the Americans had gone. The Americans, obviously, their goal was to create democracy in place of the belief that the emperor had been God and in charge of everything. But at the same time, the American definition of democracy always excludes socialists, leftists, communists for sure. So it wasn't as easy as it might have been for some filmmakers whose politics were very strongly held. What's interesting about Naked Island, although it's made after his film about Hiroshima, it seems to be almost a medieval film. The lives of the protagonists are very hard, and they have no electricity. On the island on which they live, I mean, it literally could be 500 or 1,000 years ago. And it's only when we see them visit a town or go on one of the larger boats around the island that we realize, oh wow, this is the second half of the 20th century that they're living in. But the life of the two protagonists and their children on the Naked Island is really like a Bresson film or like Man of Aaron. It's a film about the daily life of workers in the countryside, of peasants, and most of their work has to do with water. They live on an island surrounded by salt water, and there's no fresh water on the island. And so most of the film is dedicated to the process of going via boat to the mainland, getting fresh water and bringing it back. And there's little in the way of overt politics in the film. There is the moment when the wife spills water, when she's just exhausted and falls and spills one of the water containers and her husband hits her. You can certainly say that there's a political point to that, and that Shindo is saying something about men and women's relationships and work and a lot of other things, but it's not an overtly political film. It's more almost a documentary about the life of countryside people, and it only really becomes a drama when one of the children becomes ill, and the father is forced to go to the mainland. At which point the film still seems to have a medieval context to itself. I mean, the shots of the father racing across the landscape trying to find the doctor are extraordinarily impressive, beautifully composed, beautifully geometrical, but it's another world. It certainly doesn't look like the 20th century at all. And so it's interesting that Shindo, for all his political intentions and his political background, made a film that's really much more humanist than dogmatic. It was made on a very, very low budget. There were only 13 people in the crew, including the director, and they lived on the island with the actors. I mean, they lived pretty much the same life as you see the people in the film living. So in the sense of politics, making the film was certainly a political act. And it was also a huge gamble, because although it was very low budget and a very small crew, it was still shot in 35mm. It was a logistic exercise of substantial proportions to get the crew out to the island and to keep them there while the filming happened. And it really did. It sort of determined what would happen to Shindo as a filmmaker, because in a way he'd gambled the fate of his own production company. He was one of the first filmmakers to have his own production company, and he gambled it with this film. So if the film didn't do well as a filmmaker, he very easily could have been finished. Fortunately, although I don't think as a film it was like enormously popular with domestic audiences because there isn't much of a story to it. You know, it's much more an impressionistic piece. But internationally, rather as with the case of Kurosawa a few years earlier with Rashomon, the film had quite a substantial amount of success. It won prizes at 14 international festivals, including the Grand Prix at the Moscow Festival, where Visconti was on the jury. And that, I think, gave Shindo a little breathing space, gave him an opportunity to make more films, even though his style as a filmmaker changed and the variety of films that he made was quite enormous. Winning the Russian prize didn't hurt Shindo at all, in spite of which he didn't have the blessed career that Kurosawa had. I mean, Kurosawa's ability to do pretty much whatever he wanted was extraordinary. Shindo seems to have been more, if he is an American equivalent, it would be someone like John Huston or Robert Aldrich. I mean, there's a huge diversity about the films that he made. And in a way, if you look at the trajectory of his career, it seems to become less political as he struggles to make films. So a few years, just a couple of years after Naked Island, he actually went back into the medieval period and made a film about peasants. But these peasants are quite attractive women who spend a lot of time going around topless. So you can already see he's making a commercial decision to make a film that's going to be more appealing, make a horror film. Only a few years later, he was making a film called Naked 19-Year-Olds, and he'd just gone into softcore porno. A few years later, he directed one of the Zatoichi, the Blind Swordsman sequels, and just kept on going. He made a film in 2003 at the age of 91 called Owl. So for all that his career went through many twists and turns and many difficulties, he really did manage to create a sort of a substantial body of work, even if perhaps all the films weren't as important to him or as precious to him as Naked Island. The actress who plays the peasant woman is Nobuko Otowa, who plays the very villainous peasant woman in Onibaba, which Shindo made a couple of years later. Interestingly, he described her as his muse, and they later married and made a number of films together. Oshima said something interesting about Naked Island. He said that this is the image that foreign people hold of the Japanese, which is a sort of a double-edged sword, really, because, and not even strictly true, I think that foreign people probably had much more a strong idea of Japan as a feudal place full of samurai fighting, and that this was quite an unusual image. So I wonder if Oshima's comment wasn't motivated perhaps a little bit by jealousy that Shindo had managed to make such an extraordinary and such a minimalist masterpiece with such few resources.